Weather Center. A windy day ahead, big waves on the lake. Lakeshore flood warning is up. Rain will extend into the early afternoon, high 55. Partly cloudy, chilly overnight, low 41. It's 43 at O'Hare. Next news at 7. Breaking news as it happens. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Listen to AM 560, The Answer, online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, on TuneIn, iHeart, and radio.com. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560.
Just want to tell you both good luck. We're all counting on you.
The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, and I really enjoy this gentleman's work, even though we come from different philosophical places. I'm talking about Matt Taibi, and he's, I'll promote his book a couple times here, The Business Secrets of Drug Dealing, Useful Idiots podcaster, a Rolling Stone. And he writes about the trickle-up bailout out in one of his more recent posts at his website. We, as we head into the second month of the pandemic lockdown, two parallel narratives are developing about the financial rescue, writes Taibi. In one, ordinary people receive aid through programs that are piecemeal, complex, and riddled with conditions. Yeah, if they receive it at all. Many are still waiting for things like unemployment checks.
So some have been waiting for 6 weeks.
Correct.
Nothing.
Second, relief programs, the second track, relief programs aimed at the top income levels were immediate, staggering in size and scope, and often appeared as grants rather than loans. I don't disagree with that, but I want to complicate the picture a little bit. I spoke on my syndicated show last night with Andrew Biggs from the American Enterprise Institute. Mm-hmm. And he is not just somebody who writes a lot about public sector pension and debt issues. He is also a member of the Financial Oversight Board of Puerto Rico with respect to their bankruptcy. So he knows a little bit, not just in theory, but in practice, trying to reorganize a bankrupt territory. And here was his reaction initially to the news that that I provided, that in Illinois, Governor Pritzker is going ahead with $261 million in pay increases for public sector workers per their collective bargaining agreement.
For a state which, to be frank, everyone knows has been irresponsible in pension funding for decades. You know, this is not somebody hit by a car walking down the street.
Right.
This is a perennial bad actor when it comes to pension funding, and there's simply no reason this should be bailed out without conditions.
Right, and we've seen constructive bailouts just as in the public sector, just as we see in the private sector, workarounds to revitalize a business that was moribund. Detroit, prior to the outbreak at least, after its reorganization half a dozen years ago, was starting to come back a bit. I mean, it wasn't pre-China Hong Kong, but it was on the mend.
Well, there are good stories and there's not so encouraging stories. Going in, I had hoped that the elected officials on the island would really have internalized that the way they do business has to change. That they have to be more efficient how they do these things. They have to reduce corruption. They have to improve their sort of governmental quality. They have to focus on the things the government needs to do, not on what they just want to do. By and large, it's business as usual down there. But even if Illinois were to default on all the debt it owes, there are still huge unfunded liabilities in the pension system. And they've got to figure out how they address that. Because your Constitution says you can't cut benefits, but you can't get blood from a stone. If they don't have the money, they don't have the money. So it gets to be a very complicated issue.
And one of the key takeaways, and he agreed with this point that he was just leading to, is bankruptcy is not going to save Illinois or other states that have huge unfunded pension liabilities. Don't think bankruptcy is not a magic wand any more than a blank check from the federal government is. What you have in Illinois and in so many other states, and I would say inside the Beltway, is a political culture problem. And until you have people that are seriously interested in changing the political culture, paradigm change, then whether it's going to be bankruptcy or it's going to be continuing to borrow against tomorrow to pay for yesterday, you're going to have the same problems. and you're going to have the same people suffering and the same class of people benefiting. It's not just a binary. It's a to borrow the phrase of the day, it's an all-in. Really interesting about what he sees as the problem in Puerto Rico, that you would think that after that you'd have buy-in and you would have people wanting to engage in structural reform so they don't get to that place again, and that's not what's happening. Well, there's no indication anybody on either party in this state,
Right.
not anybody, but very few people in either party in this state are interested in what Biggs is talking about either, the same problem he identifies in Puerto Rico. For more on this, we're now pleased to be joined by Matt Taibi, reporter at Taibi, Taibbi.substack.com, author of The Business Secrets of Drug Dealing and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast. Matt, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
So, as I said, I concede your points about two parallel narratives about the financial rescue, but comment on the third narrative, and that's the public sector one. States that want to be bailed out by the federal government, even as the federal government is trying to bail out the federal government, which is quite a trick.
Right. Well, those are completely different stories from the ones I'm working on. I mean, I have written about the unfunded liability issue, and the dynamic that your guest didn't mention is that a lot of the states that are having problems with unfunded liabilities failed over the years to make their annual required contributions. Sometimes when times were good, they just decided to put in less, and sometimes when times were bad, they decided to put in less. And as a result, as you know, that's not how these funds work. You have to put the contribution in all the time, or else in the rainy day, the money's not going to be there. So the states that have recklessly borrowed against essentially borrowed against their pension funds to fund other liabilities, and then suddenly say that they need a bailout. Yeah, I agree. The states probably shouldn't get one. But I also don't believe that the workers should be the people who take the hit in that situation. I don't know how to resolve that issue, but it's not their fault that this happened.
Going back to the report, your piece that I was referencing earlier, the ordinary people programs versus the top income level programs. Develop that a little bit for us, those competing narratives you top-lined.
Well, I think this is something that people are beginning to see. You know, most people understand that they heard the headlines about how there are going to be $1,200 checks available to everybody, and there are going to be small business loans that should be available right away. In practice, what people are learning is that there are a whole series of conditions that you have to meet to get any one of the access to any one of these programs. They've been beset with problems, and if you do get the money, it's not necessarily going to be forgivable. There's a whole series of conditions that come attached to it. The banks are being very, very slow about delivering the loans. There's on the Main Street side, there's just lots and lots of problems, and also the money is just not enough for most people. I mean,
Right.
even if they do get the $1,200 check, you know, we have tens of millions of people who've lost their employer-based health insurance, so it's just not even close to adequate to dealing with the problem. But on the Wall Street side, they just used an immediate World War II level commitment to propping up the capital markets, and it wasn't like there was any delay. They just immediately started buying. You know, in one day it was $75 billion worth of mortgages a day, or the next day it might have been $50 billion of treasuries a day. They started buying junk bonds, corporate bonds. I mean, it's a massive, massive program that dwarfs the size of the other bailout.
Yeah, and then with all this, billions of dollars going out the door, Democrats nominated Donna Shalala to the bailout oversight panel. Wow, did you see that one coming, Matt?
I didn't. You know, there was a lot of there are a lot of issues with oversight with this whole program, and the Congressional Oversight Committee was considered one of the few opportunities Democrats would have to have some say in watching the trillions of dollars that are going out the door here. And remember, it's not just 2.3 trillion; it's really going to end up being more like 6 trillion to begin with, because they're leveraging up some of the Treasury money through the Fed. And they ended up picking the first person was an Elizabeth Warren staffer who has never done anything but that, and is maybe 6 or 7 years out of college, and then the other person is Donna Shalala, who has literally no experience with financial services. So there was when that pick was made, my phone lit up with people saying they just couldn't believe that was the person you would pick, because this is difficult stuff. To oversee this stuff, you need to really, really understand it, and they pick someone who has no background in it at all.
Well, in addition to that, she's essentially admitted, per Miami Herald report, that she violated House ethical rules when she failed to report more than a half dozen stock sales that were made last year.
Right. According to a piece of legislation called the Stock Act, which you might remember, there was a whole series of headlines back in 2012 designed to prevent public officials from engaging in insider trading. You're supposed to report all these different holdings that you have. She didn't do that, A, and B, she significantly invested in a lot of the companies and or the bond funds that are the major recipients of already the bailout programs that have been devised by the Federal Reserve. So that's a huge conflict of interest. I mean, not to say that you would think that somebody would act to protect their own individual investments, but it's just a terrible look optics-wise to need somebody who has 26 pages worth of stock and bond holdings as part of the oversight of this massive programming to prop up the capital markets. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
I understand the precipitating event is very different, but does it seem to you that we have learned much of anything from the measures that were taken in response to the financial crisis and ensuing recession in 2007 to 2009 with respect to what the government has done here? Does it seem like the business of picking winners and losers, the business of protecting institutional interests, the virtual unanimity around doing these things, it seems like we're sort of perma-freezed in terms of how the government is going to respond to these things going forward?
No, we learned nothing from that period, and we're repeating all the same mistakes we made back then. Back in 2007 through 2009, the financial services industry was racked with a problem that really originated on Wall Street. It came from an issue in which big banks, investment banks, and mortgage originators were creating huge masses of fraudulent mortgage loans and marketing them to big institutional investors like pension funds and insurance companies. They were selling mortgages that were much riskier than they were representing to their clients, and those exact companies became the recipients of the bailout programs that we devised. So that immediately creates this moral hazard issue where you're rewarding the bad actors for their bad behavior, which just incentivizes everybody to do the same thing all over again. It's part of an overall pattern where companies know that if they screw up badly enough, and if they're systemically important, quote unquote, that the state will come in and will rescue them, and won't impose a series of restrictions on top of that. So that's exactly what's happening here. A lot of the companies that are getting bailed out were extremely irresponsible with their money. You think about the airline industry, which engaged in upwards of $90 billion in stock buybacks in the eight years before this disaster. And that's how much money we're giving them. So all the cash that they gave out to their shareholders, we now have to bail out because they didn't have it.
Right, and just thinking about 2008, perhaps one of the worst actors, and his company went away, Lehman Brothers, but Dick Fuld never did. He lived happily ever after with hundreds of millions of dollars. So not just accountability, even when you break the law, as I think he unquestionably did, there's no prosecution. There's no prosecution on the financial side. There's no prosecution on the legal side. And you wonder why everybody talks about the coming class war and two Americas from different angles, but sort of essentially offering a similar diagnosis.
Yeah, and the reporters like myself, and there were a few others who covered the Wall Street response after the crash in 2008. We kept waiting, when are the cases going to start? Because we thought inevitably there are going to be a series of prosecutions of people who engaged in, the fraud. And there was tons and tons of fraud heading into 2008. And when those cases never came, it was an extraordinary second part of this disaster, because there just never was any real regulatory or law enforcement response. But there was this massive bailout, which just told Wall Street, you can do just about anything, and we're not going to come in and make anybody pay for doing anything wrong. So it's a serious problem. And I would argue the first regulatory mechanism in capitalism is letting bad companies go out of business. And we didn't do that either.
Yes.
We took that, except for Lehman Brothers. We mostly stepped in and saved bad companies.
He is Matt Taibbi. He's a reporter. I find his work at taibi.substack.com, author of The Business Secrets of Drug Dealing, co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast. Matt, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
And thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
The Lou Dobbs Financial Report is brought to you by Signature Bank, helping local businesses succeed. Visit signaturebank.bank for your commercial banking needs.
I'm Lou Dobbs. Coronavirus drug breakthrough bolsters hopes among businesses, and a big rally on Wall Street results. Boeing plans to cut 10% of its workforce. Amazon